Right now.
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 Because it's time to right now.
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 Welcome to another daily motivation live stream. I'm your host Kaufman, and today we're going to get into solid writing sprint. So let's see just what we can get into today. How is your writing coming along? Are you able to make some progress? Are you in the drafting, brainstorming stage, or somewhere in between? So welcome to the community. Day almost at 650 consecutive stream and counting, and many, many more. You know me as Kaufman, daily writing streamer, fantasy author, and dragon enthusiast. So we're going to be getting right into it. Let's see. As you can see, I already have the writing software set up. We're going off with a 30-minute sprint, and we're going to see just what we can accomplish today in this early afternoon writing sprint. So make sure to stick around for the break. We'll catch up. We'll see how we are doing. Otherwise, during the sprint, I'll come join you in the chat. But I'm eager to hopefully push into this chapter a little bit and make some progress. So let's see what we can accomplish. Awesome. And I am all ready. So whether you are writing, editing, revising, author branding, or editing, come join us because it's time to write now. And that is the first writing sprint. Were you able to make some progress that time? I know I did. I started getting into the next part of this chapter, so I feel like I was actually pretty happy with the direction that I'm going so far. I'm undecided if I'm going to keep this, make a reference. It's kind of interesting because the characters inhabit a world, the lands of the last, where it's at the end of the world, and there's so many myths, there's so much mythology of things that no longer exist. And one of our characters, the grizzly bear, is probably the closest they have to a scholar. And part of his character quirk is that he always references and knows things that no longer exist, but he's usually wrong about certain details every single time. And I very much point to that, but the other characters don't really know that because the other characters don't know anything better than him, but the reader will always pick up on it. So it creates this almost comedic bit where you don't always trust his knowledge, but you almost find it endearing with this character. But at least that's what I'm going for, so I'll see if I pull it off. I'm curious, are you guys working on any fun characters, by the way, right now? Any fun characters on your mind at the moment? Davin, you said my schedule should clear up after that, and ban ends November 1st. The marching side anyways. Well, it sounds like October's been busy for you, though, my friend. And you said you have an author-related event next week. I'll be sharing a table with a thriller writer at a local bookstore. Halloween costume contest and all. Ooh, that is exciting. Doing a Halloween event for your books and for author stuff, that's very, very exciting, Devin. Definitely wishing you the best of luck. Hope you take tons of pictures and let us know how it goes next week. That sounds like a lot of fun, actually. I wish I could be doing that. That sounds great. Oh, that sounds great. Let's see what I say. I think I saw events going on. I think there's a Renaissance fair going on here soon, which is kind of funny at this time of the year. Yeah, it was like interesting time of year for a Renaissance fair. I think that's probably an event that would work well for my book. Hey, what's up, Lynn? Hope the writing's treating you well today, friend. Let's see. Your FMC for book 4 is by far your most favorite. Ooh, that's exciting. That is very, very exciting. And that's cool, actually, that it's you're far enough into your series where you have your character for that book is the one that you prefer, which is interesting. I would normally assume that a lot of times that writers would like their main character the most, all the way from book 1, give or take. So that's definitely fascinating. It's interesting when people ask me, or when I think about it, I'm like, what is my favorite character? I love them all equally. I was like, I don't think that it's a hard one. I like each of them for different reasons. They're all my children. Aw, Devin, yeah, you're having you have nerves. You're like, I'm sure you're gonna be fine. I'm sure it's gonna be probably pretty awesome. Nerves probably help with pushing to make it even more exciting. I remember when I did a lot of theater, it's like you would always get nerves right before you went on stage, but that was kind of like part of the thrill, part of the push. That helps with the adrenaline for when you're on stage, which is fun. Yeah, and we'll definitely be looking forward to pictures. That's for certain. But yeah, I feel like I'm in a good headspace today with where I'm knocking out this chapter. I'm trying to ask myself what is too much for this chapter in terms of downtime, but I'll see. I'm kind of playing it by ear. You said FMC is the youngest of the other characters in previous books. She's fun in a Cornelia sort of way. If anyone has watched The Residence on Netflix. I'm like, which is The Residence? Oh yeah, that was that mystery. I checked that out. That was a fun show. She was definitely a fun character, actually. That actress was really, really good. I always liked her from Orange is the New Black. She was really good in that show. But I could totally see what you're going for. If you're going for that kind of like kooky, zany-ish type, like detective character type. Hey. All right, my friends. So that is good. So let's get back into it. I'm eager to hopefully make a little more push, a little more progress today. So we're going to kick back into a 30-minute writing sprint. I got time for another 30-minute one. And let's push words, ideas, motivation, something else in between. So I am all ready, whether you are writing, editing, revising, author branding, or you're just hanging out. Come join us because it's time to write now. my friends. I hope we were able to get some solid writing in today. It was interesting. I was actually going to make that a much longer chapter, but the beat ended for that chapter actually pretty well. So I ended up tying off the chapter there instead of making it a longer chapter like I was planning. I mean, I basically added a whole traveling chapter before they really hit the next destination. It's actually one of the shorter chapters, but I think it will provide a nice balance since there's been so much craziness and darkness. So I think it will. Well, we'll see. It does definitely does a number of foreshadowing things within the chapter and a lot of character building. And I was like, I think it's the first chapter in a while where it's not plot centric and it's purely character, where it's purely character development and world building. So we'll see. Characters have to get to the next point. Originally, I didn't have a transition, but I realized to make this next part of the story to feel like they're on the road traveling for a period of time, I needed it to feel longer. So I needed like a travel chapter. So I'll see if I accomplished it though. But hopefully you're able to make some progress on your end, whether you got some words, some ideas, or something else in between. But that's what we got for you today, my friends. I will be back tomorrow with the workshop. I think tomorrow's a channel member workshop. We are doing, I want to say it's a workshop on on POV and narration. So I'll be hopping into a narration, different types of narration, strategies, POV, and how to recognize POV and especially tenses in your own writing. So that way we can make sure we're writing in the tense with the right style, with the right distance of POV for our characters. So that's what I'll be doing for channel members tomorrow. And then we'll launch the video eventually for the rest of the Right Now community. Awesome. But that brings us to the end of the stream. Don't forget, words are wind, but stories are forever. I'm Kaufman, and I'll catch you on the morrow. Stay creative, writers. Words are wind, but stories are forever. I'm Kaufman, and I'll catch you on the morrow. Stay creative, writers. It's time to write.
Right now.
Sorry.
Right now, not right now, but right now. Read now, right now. Is that right?